Fragmented pit captures recovered from void station monitoring arrays show irregular distortions along the periphery of recorded space. These distortions do not conform to known gravitational lensing or electromagnetic interference. Instead, they manifest as localized absences, regions where expected visual data fails to resolve, as if light itself has been selectively removed. In multiple instances, these anomalies appear to possess motion, advancing against stellar backdrops in a manner inconsistent with orbital mechanics or drift patterns. Audio logs from the same stations frequently contain abrupt signal degradation during these events, often accompanied by low-frequency interference that cannot be traced to any mechanical source. Independent survey vessels operating beyond established trade routes have submitted corroborating reports. In these accounts, navigational instruments remain functional, yet visual confirmation of surrounding space becomes unreliable. Crew testimonies describe silhouettes that do not reflect light, shapes perceived only through the absence they impose upon their surroundings. Attempts to directly observe these phenomena often result in perceptual inconsistencies, where multiple observers report differing outlines or sizes for the same entity. In several documented cases, proximity to such distortions resulted in unexplained structural damage to vessel exteriors, despite the absence of detectable physical contact. Recovered data fragments from derelict ships provide further evidence. Hull breaches observed in these vessels do not correspond to known weapon signatures. Edges of impacted materials appear uniformly degraded, as though matter had been excised rather than displaced. Internal compartments frequently show signs of abrupt depressurization without the expected cascading failures in adjacent sections. Biological remains, when present, exhibit patterns of damage inconsistent with decompression or conventional trauma. Tissue samples often display partial absence, with no indication of residue or dispersal. Long-range auger scans have intermittently detected energy signatures associated with these phenomena, though such readings are inconsistent and difficult to replicate. When captured, the signatures suggest localized fluctuations in both real space and immaterium boundaries. These fluctuations do not align with standard warp activity, lacking the turbulent characteristics typically associated with warp breaches. Instead, they present as stable yet transient distortions existing briefly before dissipating without trace. Cross-referencing these findings with archived records reveals scattered mentions of similar occurrences across multiple millennia. Early accounts, often dismissed as sensor errors or void-farer superstition, describe entities composed not of matter but of absence. These records consistently note an aversion to illumination, with the phenomena either retreating from or being diminished by intense light sources. However, in later reports, this behavior becomes less predictable, suggesting either adaptation or misinterpretation in earlier observations. Attempts to classify these entities within existing taxonomies have proven inconclusive. They do not exhibit characteristics consistent with known xenos species, nor do they conform to recognized warp entities. Their interaction with physical matter indicates a capacity for direct influence within real space, yet their apparent composition challenges conventional definitions of material existence. As such, they occupy an uncertain position within Imperial records, often categorized under provisional designations pending further study. The term most frequently associated with these anomalies appears in fragmented data archives and scattered field reports. It is referenced without formal classification, often appended as a cautionary note rather than a definitive identification. Despite the lack of consensus regarding their nature, the consistency of this designation across disparate sources suggests a shared recognition among those who have encountered the phenomenon. Documented references to the Umbra remain sparse and often incomplete, reflecting both the difficulty of studying such entities and the high attrition rate among those who attempt to do so. What can be established with relative certainty is that the Umbra do not conform to standard biological models. There is no evidence of cellular structure, metabolic processes, or reproductive cycles as understood in conventional life forms. Instead, they appear to exist as cohesive manifestations of shadow, maintaining form without reliance on observable physical frameworks. Earliest credible records suggest that encounters with the Umbra occurred in regions of low stellar density, where ambient light levels are minimal. In these environments, the entities demonstrate greater stability and persistence, maintaining defined shapes for extended periods. Descriptions of these shapes vary, though most accounts agree on a general lack of fixed geometry. Observers frequently report shifting outlines, as though the entity's boundaries are in constant flux. This variability complicates efforts to determine size, though estimates typically place individual Umbra at dimensions comparable to small voidcraft. Despite their amorphous nature, the Umbra exhibit coordinated movement and apparent intent. They are capable of altering trajectory in response to external stimuli, including the presence of vessels, light sources, and energy emissions. In some instances, they have been observed to pursue targets over considerable distances, maintaining consistent velocity without detectable propulsion mechanisms. This behavior implies a form of internal energy or interaction with forces not yet understood. Interaction with physical matter provides the most direct evidence of the Umbra's capabilities. When in proximity to solid objects, they are able to induce localized degradation. This process does not resemble cutting, burning, or corrosive action. Instead, affected material appears to vanish, leaving behind clean boundaries that suggest removal rather than transformation. The mechanism by which this occurs remains unknown, though some theorists propose a form of spatial displacement or dimensional overlap. Biological organisms are similarly affected, though the implications are more severe. Survivors of partial exposure report intense disorientation and sensory disruption, often accompanied by localized tissue loss. In cases of prolonged contact, the results are invariably fatal. Autopsy reports, where available, indicate that affected areas lack any trace of removed material, supporting the hypothesis that the Umbra do not consume matter in a traditional sense, but rather displace it entirely. Light appears to play a significant role in interactions with the Umbra. Early observations indicate that high-intensity illumination can disrupt their cohesion, causing visible contraction or fragmentation. This has led to the widespread assumption that the entities are vulnerable to light-based countermeasures. However, subsequent encounters complicate this assessment. In several documented cases, Umbra exposed to sustained illumination adapted by altering their behavior, avoiding direct exposure while continuing to engage targets from peripheral darkness. This adaptive capacity suggests a level of responsiveness that extends beyond simple reaction. While there is no evidence of cognition in the conventional sense, the Umbra demonstrate behavior that implies environmental awareness and the ability to modify actions accordingly. Whether this constitutes intelligence remains a matter of debate, as their actions lack the complexity typically associated with sentient decision-making. The origin of the Umbra remains unresolved. No confirmed homeworld or point of emergence has been identified, and their distribution appears irregular. They are not confined to a specific region of the galaxy, though encounters are more frequently reported in areas with limited Imperial presence. This distribution pattern may reflect observational bias rather than actual concentration, as regions with higher monitoring density are more likely to detect and report anomalies. Several hypotheses have been proposed regarding their nature. One suggests that the Umbra are remnants of a previously unknown form of life, existing in a state that straddles the boundary between real space and another dimension. Another posits that they are byproducts of warp phenomena, entities that have achieved partial stability outside the immaterium without fully transitioning into it. A third theory considers the possibility that they are artificial constructs, though no evidence of technological origin has been identified. What remains consistent across all credible accounts is the Umbra's capacity to exist where light is absent, and to impose that absence upon their surroundings. They are not merely creatures that inhabit darkness, they appear to embody it in a fundamental way. This distinction is critical, as it defines their interactions with both environment and observer. Where an Umbra is present, darkness is not simply the absence of light, but an active condition imposed upon reality itself. Efforts to study the Umbra in controlled conditions have been largely unsuccessful. Attempts to capture or contain these entities have resulted in equipment loss and personnel casualties. Standard containment fields prove ineffective, as the Umbra do not interact with energy barriers in predictable ways. In some cases, they have passed through such barriers without resistance, while in others they have caused localized failures upon contact. This inconsistency further complicates efforts to establish reliable containment protocols. The lack of reproducible data has hindered the development of effective countermeasures. While illumination remains the most commonly employed deterrent, its reliability is limited. High-output light sources can provide temporary protection, but they require significant energy expenditure and are not always practical in combat or exploration scenarios. Additionally, the potential for Umbra adaptation raises concerns regarding the long-term viability of such strategies. As a result, most encounters with the Umbra are treated as hazards to be avoided rather than threats to be engaged. Imperial doctrine, where applicable, emphasizes evasion and minimal contact. Vessels operating in regions with known Umbra activity are advised to maintain maximum illumination and to withdraw at the first sign of anomalous sensor readings. These guidelines reflect the current understanding of the Umbra as entities that cannot be reliably confronted with existing technology. Despite these limitations, interest in the Umbra persists among various branches of Imperial study. Their unique properties challenge established models of both biology and physics, offering potential insights into phenomena that remain poorly understood. However, such interest is tempered by the risks involved, as each attempt to expand knowledge carries the possibility of further loss. In summary, the Umbra represent a class of entities defined by absence rather than presence. Their origins are unknown, their structure defies conventional analysis, and their behavior resists simple classification. What is known is derived from fragmented observations and incomplete data, forming a picture that is both consistent in its core elements and uncertain in its details. As such, they remain an unresolved subject within Imperial records, their true nature obscured by the very darkness they embody. Direct observation of the Umbra remains constrained by the same limitations that define their existence. They are not composed of matter in any conventional sense, and therefore cannot be examined through dissection, sampling, or mechanical capture. What is understood regarding their distinctive traits is derived from repeated encounter logs, sensor interpretations, and the comparative analysis of damage patterns attributed to their presence. These data points, while incomplete, establish a consistent profile of behavior and capability that distinguishes the Umbra from all other recorded entities. The most immediately recognizable trait of the Umbra is their interaction with light. Unlike organisms that avoid illumination due to sensitivity or predation risk, the Umbra demonstrate a direct and measurable effect on photons within their vicinity. Light entering the boundary of an Umbra does not scatter, reflect, or refract. It ceases to propagate. This effect creates a visual phenomenon that appears as absolute blackness, not merely shadow, but a void in which no detail can be resolved. The edges of this void are rarely stable. Observers consistently report a shifting perimeter, as though the boundary between illuminated space and the Umbra is in constant motion. This instability extends to their overall form. While early reports attempted to describe the Umbra as amorphous masses, later observations indicate that they possess a form of structural cohesion. Their silhouettes often suggest elongated or tendril-like extensions, which can retract or expand depending on proximity to external stimuli. These extensions are not fixed appendages but dynamic projections of the entity's overall structure. They appear to function as both sensory and interaction mechanisms, allowing the Umbra to extend influence beyond their central mass. The scale of individual Umbra varies, though most documented instances fall within a range comparable to small voidcraft or atmospheric gunships. However, size estimation is inherently unreliable due to their effect on light and the absence of reference points within their immediate vicinity. Sensor readings occasionally suggest larger dimensions than visual observation would indicate, implying that the Umbra may extend beyond what can be directly perceived. Another defining trait is their method of locomotion. The Umbra do not rely on propulsion systems, muscular movement, or any identifiable force generation. Instead, they translate through space with a smooth, continuous motion that does not produce detectable exhaust, vibration, or displacement. This movement is not random. It demonstrates directional intent, with the Umbra capable of adjusting trajectory in response to environmental changes. In several recorded encounters, they have been observed to match the velocity of moving vessels, maintaining a constant relative position over extended periods. This capacity for controlled movement is accompanied by a form of environmental awareness. The Umbra respond to variations in light intensity, energy output, and spatial configuration. They are particularly reactive to concentrated light sources, often altering course to avoid direct exposure. However, this avoidance is not absolute. In certain cases, Umbra have approached illuminated targets indirectly, positioning themselves in areas where light coverage is incomplete. This behavior indicates an ability to interpret spatial conditions and exploit weaknesses in environmental defenses. The interaction between the Umbra and physical matter is their most significant and hazardous trait. Contact does not result in impact, abrasion, or thermal damage. Instead, affected material undergoes immediate and localized absence. The transition is abrupt, with no intermediate state or observable process. Surfaces remain smooth at the point of removal, lacking the deformation or residue that would typically accompany material loss. This effect has been observed across a wide range of substances, including metals, composites, and biological tissue, suggesting that it is not dependent on material composition. The mechanism behind this interaction remains unknown, but its consistency allows it to be treated as a defining characteristic. In practical terms, it functions as a form of destructive capability inherent to the Umbra's existence. It does not require activation, targeting systems, or external tools. Wherever the Umbra extends its form, this effect is present. As a result, their entire structure can be considered both body and weapon simultaneously. These extensions, often described as tendrils, appear to be the primary means by which the Umbra interact with their environment. They can elongate rapidly, bridging distances that exceed the apparent size of the central mass. When these extensions make contact with an object, the same absence effect occurs along the point of contact. In several documented cases, these tendrils have penetrated hull plating, internal bulkheads, and structural supports in a single continuous motion, leaving linear voids that compromise the integrity of the affected structure. Despite this capability, the Umbra do not exhibit behavior consistent with indiscriminate destruction. Their actions suggest selective engagement. They do not uniformly consume all matter within reach, but instead focus on specific targets or regions. This selectivity implies a form of prioritization, though the criteria for such decisions remain unclear. In some encounters, they have ignored non-illuminated objects entirely while concentrating on areas with active energy emissions. Energy interaction is another aspect of their distinctive profile. The Umbra do not generate detectable energy signatures in the manner of conventional systems. However, their presence is often associated with disruptions in localized energy fields. Electrical systems in close proximity may experience fluctuations, signal degradation, or complete failure. These effects are not consistent enough to be used as reliable detection methods, but they reinforce the conclusion that the Umbra influence their surroundings beyond direct physical interaction. Attempts to engage the Umbra with conventional weaponry have yielded limited results. Projectile-based weapons pass through their form without measurable impact, as there is no solid structure to absorb or deflect the force. Energy weapons, including directed plasma and laser systems, show variable effectiveness. In some instances, high-intensity beams have caused temporary distortion in the Umbra's structure, leading to partial dispersion or contraction. However, these effects are short-lived, with the entity reconstituting its form once the energy source is removed. Among these methods, sustained high lumen output remains the most consistently observed deterrent. When exposed to concentrated light, the Umbra's boundaries contract, and their tendril extensions retract. This response suggests that light interferes with the mechanism by which they maintain cohesion. The exact nature of this interference is not understood, but it provides a practical basis for defensive measures. However, the effectiveness of light is dependent on intensity and coverage. Partial illumination creates zones of relative safety, but does not eliminate the threat entirely. In terms of defensive characteristics, the Umbra do not possess armor, shielding, or structural reinforcement in any recognizable form. Their resilience is instead a function of their non-material composition. Damage, as understood in conventional terms, does not apply. Disruption of their form through light or energy does not result in lasting impairment, and there is no evidence of cumulative degradation over time. This suggests that their existence is maintained by a process that operates independently of physical integrity. There is no evidence of tools, devices, or constructed equipment associated with the Umbra. They do not utilize weapons, wear armor, or employ external mechanisms to enhance their capabilities. All observed effects are intrinsic to their form. This absence of gear distinguishes them from both biological organisms and technological constructs, reinforcing their classification as entities that do not fit within established categories. Communication, if it exists, has not been identified. The Umbra do not emit signals in any known spectrum, nor do they produce sound or other detectable forms of information exchange. Multiple Umbra have been observed within the same vicinity on rare occasions, but there is no clear evidence of coordinated behavior between them. Their movements do not display patterns that would indicate organized group activity, though the limited number of such encounters prevents definitive conclusions. One additional trait of note is their persistence in low-light environments. In regions where ambient illumination is minimal, the Umbra demonstrate increased stability. Their forms become more defined, and their movement appears less erratic. This suggests that the surrounding light level influences not only their visibility, but also their structural coherence. In such conditions, they are more difficult to disrupt and may remain present for extended durations. Conversely, in high-light environments, their presence is often transient. They appear briefly, interact with their surroundings, and then withdraw or dissipate. This pattern has led to the hypothesis that the Umbra are not fully compatible with environments dominated by intense illumination. Rather than being destroyed by light, they are displaced or destabilized to the point where continued presence is unsustainable. Taken together, these traits establish the Umbra as entities defined by absence, mobility, and intrinsic destructive capability. They do not rely on external tools or conventional biological systems. Their interaction with the environment is direct and fundamental, altering the state of matter and light without intermediary processes. While their behavior suggests a degree of responsiveness, it does not align with known models of intelligence or instinct. In the absence of a clearer framework, the Umbra are best understood through the consistency of their effects rather than the interpretation of their nature. They remove light, they traverse space without propulsion, and they erase matter upon contact. These characteristics, observed across multiple encounters and time periods, form the basis of all current knowledge regarding their distinctive traits. Beyond this, their true composition and underlying mechanisms remain unresolved, leaving their classification incomplete and their capabilities only partially understood. The question of personality, when applied to the Umbra, presents an immediate limitation. Across all credible records, there is no indication that the Umbra possess individuality in the manner observed in biological organisms or even in certain classes of warp entities. They do not display consistent behavioral variants that would suggest distinct identities. No two encounters have produced evidence of recognizable differentiation between individual specimens. Instead, all documented Umbra exhibit a narrow but consistent range of responses to environmental stimuli, implying that what is being observed is not a collection of individuals with personalities, but a recurring manifestation of a single behavioral framework. Despite this absence of individuality, their actions are not random. The Umbra demonstrate repeatable patterns that can be interpreted as behavioral tendencies. they show a persistent attraction to zones of low illumination, often positioning themselves within shadows cast by larger structures or celestial bodies. When such zones are absent, they tend to create them indirectly, by moving in ways that maximize their own obscuring effect. This behavior reinforces the conclusion that darkness is not merely a preferred condition, but a functional requirement for their stability. They also exhibit what can be described as selective engagement. The Umbra do not indiscriminately interact with all matter in their vicinity. Instead, they appear to prioritize targets associated with energy output, structural complexity, or movement. Stationary debris, inactive systems, and inert masses are often ignored, even when in close proximity. In contrast, active vessels, powered installations, and regions of fluctuating energy draw consistent attention. This pattern suggests that the Umbra are responsive to specific environmental signatures, though whether this response is driven by necessity, attraction, or some form of predation remains unclear. There is no evidence to support the presence of emotion, instinctual aggression, or territorial behavior. The Umbra do not pursue targets with escalating intensity, nor do they demonstrate persistence beyond a certain threshold. In several recorded encounters, they disengaged from targets that maintained sustained illumination, or withdrew from areas where environmental conditions became unfavorable. This indicates that their actions are governed by constraints rather than intent in the conventional sense. Communication between Umbra, if it occurs, remains undetected. Instances where multiple entities have been observed in proximity do not show coordinated movement or shared targeting behavior. Each Umbra appears to operate independently, without forming formations, hierarchies, or collective strategies. This lack of observable interaction suggests that they do not function as a cohesive species or organized group. Instead, their presence in the same region may be coincidental, driven by similar environmental conditions rather than any form of mutual awareness. Organizational alignment, as defined within Imperial frameworks, is entirely absent. The Umbra are not aligned with any known faction, xenos empire, or warp-based entity group. They do not serve, follow, or respond to external commands. No record exists of the Umbra being directed, controlled, or influenced by other forces. Attempts to draw parallels between the Umbra and known classifications, such as demonic entities or autonomous constructs, have consistently failed due to the lack of defining characteristics shared with those categories. They do not exhibit the hallmarks of warp entities. While their interaction with light and matter suggests a connection to non-physical processes, they do not display the volatility, symbolic manifestation, or psychic resonance typical of warp-born beings. There is no evidence of emotional imprinting, ritualistic behavior, or dependency on psychic energy. Their presence does not correlate with warp disturbances in a predictable manner, and they do not respond to psychic activity in a way that would suggest alignment with the immaterium. Similarly, they do not align with technological constructs. There are no indications of artificial design, no detectable components, and no signs of maintenance or degradation. Their behavior lacks the programmed consistency or adaptive learning patterns associated with autonomous machines. While they demonstrate responsiveness, it does not follow the structured logic of artificial systems. The absence of alignment extends to their interaction with the broader environment. The Umbra do not alter ecosystems, establish territory, or leave lasting changes beyond the immediate effects of their presence. Once they withdraw or dissipate, the affected area remains unchanged except for the material loss they have caused. There is no evidence of reproduction, resource gathering, or long-term habitation. This reinforces the interpretation that they are transient phenomena rather than a sustained population. Given these factors, the Umbra are best understood as entities that exist outside conventional definitions of personality and organization. Their behavior is consistent enough to be predictable in certain contexts, but it does not originate from intention, identity, or allegiance. Instead, it appears to be the result of underlying conditions that dictate their interaction with the environment. From a functional perspective, the Umbra can be analysed through the effects they produce rather than the motivations behind them. They seek or require darkness, avoid sustained illumination, and interact selectively with matter and energy. These behaviors form a closed system of responses that define their presence without requiring additional interpretation. Attempts to assign motive or purpose introduce assumptions that are not supported by available evidence. In evaluating their role within the broader context of the galaxy, the Umbra occupy a unique position. They are neither active participants in conflict nor passive elements of the environment. Their presence introduces localized disruption, but they do not engage in warfare, expansion, or defense. They do not compete for resources, nor do they appear to depend on any form of sustenance. This places them outside the ecological and strategic frameworks typically used to classify both biological and non-biological entities. One possible interpretation is that the Umbra represent a form of boundary condition between states of existence. Their interaction with light and matter suggests that they operate at the limits of what can be sustained within real space. The absence they impose may not be an action in itself, but a consequence of their presence, much like the effect of extreme gravitational forces on surrounding matter. In this view, the Umbra are not agents of change, but manifestations of a condition that disrupts the normal behavior of physical systems. Another interpretation considers the possibility that the Umbra are incomplete entities, existing only partially within real space. Their lack of stable structure, combined with their transient behavior, supports the idea that they are not fully anchored within the dimension they occupy. This could explain their sensitivity to light and their inconsistent interaction with energy fields. If this is the case, their behavior may be governed by forces or constraints that are not directly observable, limiting their ability to persist or act beyond certain parameters. A third perspective focuses on their apparent indifference to most environmental factors. The Umbra do not respond to threats in a defensive manner, nor do they exploit opportunities in a way that would suggest strategic awareness. This detachment implies that their behavior is not goal-oriented but condition-driven. They act because certain conditions are met, and they cease to act when those conditions change. This framework removes the need to attribute intention, and instead places emphasis on the underlying mechanisms that enable their existence. In all interpretations, a common conclusion emerges. The Umbra cannot be effectively understood through analogies to known life forms, technologies, or warp entities. Their defining characteristics do not align with any established category, and attempts to force such alignment result in incomplete or contradictory explanations. They represent a gap in current understanding, highlighting the limitations of existing models when confronted with phenomena that do not conform to expected parameters. From an analytical standpoint, the most reliable approach is to treat the Umbra as a consistent set of observable effects. They remove light, they traverse space without conventional means, and they erase matter upon contact. Their behavior follows identifiable patterns, but those patterns do not imply intent or organization. They are present under certain conditions and absent under others, with no indication of continuity beyond individual encounters. This perspective informs current Imperial protocols regarding the Umbra. Without a clear understanding of their nature, engagement strategies are limited to avoidance and mitigation. There is no basis for negotiation, containment, or integration. The Umbra cannot be reasoned with, redirected, or repurposed. They exist as an environmental hazard, albeit one that challenges the definition of environment itself. The final assessment of the Umbra remains necessarily incomplete. Their origin is unknown, their structure is undefined, and their purpose, if any exists, cannot be determined. What can be stated with certainty is that they operate according to principles that are not yet understood, interacting with reality in ways that defy conventional explanation. Their consistency across millennia suggests that they are not anomalies in the sense of rare or singular events, but rather stable occurrences within a framework that has yet to be fully recognized. In this context, the Umbra are not simply a subject of study, but an indication of the limits of current knowledge. They reveal the existence of processes that cannot be adequately described using existing terminology or theory. Until such frameworks are expanded or revised, the Umbra will remain classified not by what they are, but by what they do, and by the absence they leave in both matter and understanding. Records attributed to the Adeptus Administratum concerning the Umbra are limited in number but consistent in structure. Most entries originate from void traffic logs, shipping registries, and incident reports filed after unexplained losses or structural anomalies. These records do not initially identify the Umbra as a distinct classification. Instead, early documentation categorizes such events under navigation hazards, equipment malfunction, or unidentified xenos interference. Only through longitudinal comparison across multiple sectors did a pattern emerge, prompting the consolidation of these incidents under a single provisional designation. The Administratum's primary concern is logistical continuity. As such, its impressions of the Umbra are framed through the lens of disruption to establish trade routes and resource distribution networks. Reports indicate that regions with recurring Umbra sightings experience measurable declines in vessel traffic over time. This decline is not enforced through direct prohibition, but arises from cumulative losses and increased risk assessments issued by sector authorities. Merchant captains and transport guilds, operating within acceptable margins of risk, gradually reroute away from affected corridors, creating indirect supply deficiencies in dependent systems. Quantitative analysis of these disruptions reveals a disproportionate impact on low-priority supply chains. Essential military shipments, escorted by naval assets and equipped with higher output illumination systems, maintain partial continuity. In contrast, civilian and auxiliary transports, which lack such protections, exhibit significantly higher attrition rates when operating in Umbra active zones. Over extended periods, this imbalance results in localized shortages of non-critical goods, including industrial components, agricultural supplements, and civilian infrastructure materials. Administratum data also highlights inconsistencies in reporting frequency. Systems with established monitoring infrastructure record Umbra-related anomalies with greater regularity, while frontier regions show sporadic or delayed documentation. This disparity suggests that the actual distribution of Umbra encounters is broader than recorded data indicates. The absence of reports in certain areas cannot be interpreted as absence of activity, but rather as a limitation in detection and communication capabilities. In response to these findings, the Administratum has implemented adaptive routing protocols. These protocols do not formally designate Umbra zones as restricted, but they adjust recommended navigation paths based on cumulative incident density. Over time, this has resulted in the gradual redirection of trade arteries, with secondary routes gaining prominence as primary corridors are deemed increasingly hazardous. This redistribution of traffic introduces additional strain on infrastructure not originally designed to support high-volume transit, leading to secondary logistical inefficiencies. The Adeptus Mechanicus approaches the Umbra from a fundamentally different perspective. Where the Administratum focuses on continuity and loss mitigation, the Mechanicus prioritizes classification, analysis, and potential application. Their impressions are derived from sensor data, recovered technology, and controlled observational studies conducted under high-risk conditions. Despite repeated attempts, the Mechanicus has not succeeded in isolating or containing an Umbra specimen for sustained examination. As a result, their findings rely heavily on indirect measurement and post-event analysis. Mechanicus sensor logs provide the most detailed quantitative insights into Umbra behavior. Auger arrays detect localized reductions in photon density, often accompanied by minor fluctuations in gravitational and electromagnetic readings. These fluctuations are subtle, falling within margins that would typically be dismissed as background variance. However, when correlated with visual anomalies and structural damage reports, they form a consistent pattern that distinguishes Umbra activity from other forms of interference. One of the more significant findings relates to the interaction between the Umbra and energy systems. Mechanicus data indicates that active power sources act as attractors, increasing the likelihood of Umbra proximity. Reactors operating at higher outputs generate stronger correlations, suggesting that the Umbra are responsive to energy gradients rather than specific frequencies. This has led to the hypothesis that the Umbra perceive, or are influenced by energy differentials within their environment, using them as reference points for movement and interaction. Experimental adjustments to energy output have produced limited but notable results. In controlled scenarios, gradual reduction of reactor activity corresponded with decreased Umbra engagement, while sudden increases in output triggered more direct interaction. These observations support the theory that the Umbra are sensitive to dynamic changes rather than static conditions. However, the practical application of this knowledge is constrained by operational requirements, as reducing power output is not always feasible in active deployments. The Mechanicus has also conducted extensive analysis of material degradation associated with Umbra contact. Samples recovered from affected vessels show no chemical alteration, thermal damage, or residue. Spectrographic analysis confirms that the missing material does not exist in altered form within the surrounding environment. This absence reinforces the conclusion that the Umbra do not transform matter, but remove it from observable space. The mechanism for this removal remains unidentified, though several models have been proposed. One prevailing theory suggests a localized collapse of spatial cohesion, wherein matter within the Umbra's influence is displaced beyond the bounds of real space. Another posits a form of phase transition, where affected material is shifted into a state that cannot be detected by conventional means. A third hypothesis considers the possibility of microscale warp interaction, though the lack of associated warp signatures weakens this interpretation. Each model accounts for certain aspects of the observed data but fails to provide a comprehensive explanation. The Mechanicus has attempted to quantify the threshold at which light disrupts Umbra cohesion. High-intensity lumen arrays calibrated across a range of outputs have been deployed in proximity to confirmed sightings. Results indicate a direct correlation between light intensity and Umbra contraction, with higher outputs producing more pronounced effects. However, the relationship is not linear. Beyond a certain threshold, increases in intensity yield diminishing returns, suggesting that the Umbra's response is governed by factors beyond simple photon density. Further complicating this analysis is the Umbra's apparent capacity for adaptation. In repeated exposure scenarios, entities exhibited altered movement patterns, avoiding direct illumination while maintaining proximity to the source. This behavior indicates that while light affects their structure, it does not render them inert. Instead, it imposes constraints that the Umbra can navigate within, maintaining operational presence without direct confrontation. Logistical findings from the Mechanicus also include the impact of Umbra activity on technological systems. Proximity to an Umbra often results in transient disruptions to machine function, particularly in systems reliant on precise energy regulation. Data corruption, signal interference, and temporary shutdowns have been recorded, though these effects are inconsistent and not fully predictable. Shielded systems show marginally improved resilience, but no configuration has proven immune. Maintenance records from vessels operating in Umbra-active regions indicate increased wear on illumination systems and power distribution networks. High lumen arrays, when used continuously, experience accelerated degradation, requiring more frequent replacement and calibration. This introduces additional logistical burdens, as spare components and maintenance cycles must be adjusted to accommodate the increased demand. Over time, this contributes to the overall cost of operating in affected zones, further incentivizing route avoidance. The combined impressions of the Administratum and Mechanicus converge on a shared conclusion. The Umbra represent a persistent and unpredictable variable within the operational environment. They do not conform to established threat models, and their impact extends beyond direct interaction, influencing trade patterns, infrastructure stability, and technological reliability. While not actively hostile in a strategic sense, their presence introduces a level of uncertainty that complicates both logistical planning and scientific analysis. From an analytical standpoint, the Umbra can be integrated into existing frameworks only as an external factor, similar to environmental hazards such as radiation fields or gravitational anomalies. However, unlike these phenomena, the Umbra exhibit mobility and responsiveness, preventing them from being treated as static conditions. This distinction requires continuous monitoring and adaptive strategies, rather than fixed protocols. The Mechanicus continues to pursue deeper understanding, driven by the potential implications of the Umbra's properties. The ability to remove matter without trace, if understood and controlled, would represent a significant advancement in both industrial and military applications. However, the risks associated with such research remain high, and progress has been limited. Each attempt to expand knowledge encounters the same fundamental barrier: the inability to isolate and study the Umbra under controlled conditions. In parallel, the Administratum refines its logistical models, incorporating Umbra activity into predictive algorithms. These models aim to minimize disruption by anticipating regions of increased risk and adjusting resource allocation accordingly. While effective to a degree, they remain reactive rather than proactive, dependent on historical data rather than real-time control. In conclusion, the Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus approach the Umbra from different but complementary perspectives. One measures impact in terms of supply, movement, and systemic stability. The other seeks to understand underlying mechanisms and potential applications. Both are constrained by the same limitation. The Umbra resist direct study and defy complete classification. As a result, their impressions remain provisional, shaped by observable effects, rather than definitive knowledge, and subject to revision as new data emerges. Documented conflicts involving the Umbra are not wars in the conventional sense. There are no campaigns, no declared hostilities, and no sustained engagements between opposing forces. Instead, the available records describe isolated encounters in which Imperial assets, most often voidcraft or orbital installations, were forced into reactive combat situations following unexpected contact. These incidents, while lacking strategic continuity, provide the most detailed accounts of how the Umbra behave under conditions of resistance and how Imperial forces have attempted to counter them. One of the earliest consolidated records originates from a cluster of transport losses along a secondary trade corridor operating between lightly monitored systems. Initial reports categorize the incidents as piracy or navigational failure. However, recovery of a single heavily damaged bulk hauler provided sufficient data to revise this assessment. The vessel's exterior hull exhibited multiple linear voids, each penetrating several decks without evidence of explosive force or thermal scoring. Internal logs, partially recovered, indicated a progressive loss of external illumination systems prior to the breach events. Crew responses focused on restoring light output rather than engaging an identified threat, suggesting that the nature of the hazard was not immediately understood. Subsequent escort deployment introduced armed naval presence into the corridor. In the first recorded engagement, a patrol frigate detected an anomaly consistent with Umbra signatures at extended range. Standard engagement protocol was initiated, including the activation of forward weapon batteries and defensive shielding. As the anomaly closed distance, visual confirmation failed, with only a distortion in surrounding starlight indicating its position. The frigate opened fire using directed energy weapons calibrated for anti-voidcraft engagement. Logs indicate that initial volleys passed through the anomaly without measurable impact. However, sustained fire at maximum output produced a temporary contraction in the distortion field, confirming partial responsiveness to high energy exposure. During this engagement, the Umbra altered trajectory, moving along the vessel's outer hull rather than approaching directly. This movement coincided with localized system failures, particularly within the ship's lighting grid and secondary power relays. Within moments, sections of the hull experienced the characteristic absence effect, resulting in decompression across multiple compartments. Emergency bulkheads deployed as designed, preventing total structural collapse, but the vessel sustained critical damage. The Umbra disengaged shortly after, withdrawing beyond sensor range without further pursuit. The engagement concluded without destruction of the entity or recovery of additional data. Another significant incident occurred in proximity to an orbital relay station positioned within a low-traffic system. The station, designed for long-range communication and navigation support, maintained continuous high-output illumination across its external structure. This configuration initially appeared to deter Umbra presence, as no anomalies had been recorded during the station's operational history. However, a sudden fluctuation in power distribution, attributed to routine maintenance, resulted in a temporary reduction in light intensity across several sectors. Within this interval, station personnel reported visual distortions along the outer framework. Automated defense systems activated in response to detected anomalies, deploying both projectile and energy-based countermeasures. As with previous encounters, projectile fire proved ineffective. Energy discharges produced localized disruption, but failed to achieve sustained effect. The Umbra exploited the reduced illumination zones, extending tendril-like projections into structural supports and communication arrays. Damage reports indicate that multiple relay nodes were rendered inoperative within a short time frame, severely degrading the station's functionality. Efforts to restore full illumination were prioritized over direct engagement. Once light levels returned to maximum output, the Umbra withdrew, leaving behind extensive structural voids. The station remained operational, but required significant repair and recalibration. This incident reinforced the importance of continuous illumination and highlighted the vulnerability introduced by even brief lapses in light coverage. A more complex engagement is recorded in the logs of a Mechanicus exploratory vessel, tasked with surveying an uncharted region. Unlike standard Imperial ships, this vessel was equipped with enhanced sensor arrays and experimental energy modulation systems. Upon detecting Umbra signatures, the vessel's command elected to conduct controlled interaction rather than immediate withdrawal. This decision was based on the presence of specialized equipment designed to vary energy output across multiple frequencies. The initial phase of the encounter involved incremental increases in localized energy emissions. The Umbra responded by approaching the vessel, maintaining a consistent distance while adjusting position relative to the changing energy fields. As the experiment progressed, the vessel introduced rapid fluctuations in output, alternating between high and low intensity. This produced a measurable change in Umbra behavior, with the entity exhibiting irregular movement patterns and reduced stability in its form. Encouraged by these results, the vessel initiated a sustained high-output sequence combined with full-spectrum illumination. For a brief period, the Umbra's structure appeared to fragment, with portions of its form dispersing into surrounding space. However, this state was not maintained. The entity reconstituted rapidly, adapting its movement to avoid direct exposure, while continuing to interact with the vessel's outer systems. The encounter escalated when the Umbra extended multiple tendrils simultaneously, breaching external sensor arrays and compromising several experimental modules. At this stage, the vessel's command terminated the experiment and initiated withdrawal procedures. The Umbra pursued for a limited duration, maintaining proximity despite increased velocity and evasive maneuvers. Only after the vessel achieved a threshold distance and stabilized its energy output did the entity disengage. Post-engagement analysis concluded that while energy modulation influenced Umbra behavior, it did not provide a reliable method of neutralization. In contrast to these reactive engagements, there are also records of Umbra presence during active war zones, though their role remains incidental rather than intentional. One such instance involves a naval confrontation between Imperial forces and an unidentified xenos fleet in a region characterized by low stellar illumination. During the engagement, multiple vessels reported sensor anomalies consistent with Umbra activity. These anomalies were initially disregarded due to the intensity of the ongoing battle. As the conflict progressed, several ships on both sides experienced unexplained structural failures. These failures did not correspond to known weapon impacts and occurred in areas not directly targeted by enemy fire. Subsequent analysis identified the presence of Umbra within the engagement zone, likely drawn by the high energy output of active combat systems. Their interaction with both fleets introduced additional variables, complicating tactical coordination and contributing to overall losses. Notably, the Umbra did not differentiate between factions. Their interaction with vessels was consistent regardless of allegiance, targeting areas of energy concentration and structural vulnerability. This neutrality reinforces the conclusion that their behavior is not influenced by strategic considerations, but by environmental conditions present during the conflict. Ground-based encounters are less frequently documented, but one notable case involves a research outpost established on a planet with minimal atmospheric light diffusion. The outpost maintained a network of illumination towers to compensate for the low ambient light levels. During a prolonged period of reduced maintenance capability, several towers fell into disrepair, creating extended regions of shadow. Personnel reports describe the appearance of moving darkness within these zones, followed by the gradual loss of equipment and structural integrity. Defensive measures, including portable light sources and directed energy weapons, were deployed with limited success. The Umbra demonstrated the same pattern of selective engagement, targeting active systems and avoiding fully illuminated areas. Evacuation was ultimately ordered after critical infrastructure was compromised. The outpost was abandoned, and no further attempts at reclamation have been recorded. Across all documented conflicts, a consistent pattern emerges. The Umbra do not initiate engagements in the manner of conventional adversaries. Their presence becomes a factor when environmental conditions align with their operational parameters. Once present, they interact with their surroundings in a way that produces effects indistinguishable from targeted attacks, despite the absence of identifiable intent. Imperial forces, when confronted with the Umbra, adopt a defensive posture focused on mitigation rather than destruction. Engagement protocols prioritize maintaining or increasing illumination, stabilizing energy output, and withdrawing from affected areas when possible. Offensive measures, while occasionally effective in disrupting Umbra cohesion, do not achieve lasting results and often expose vessels to additional risk. The classification of these incidents as battles or conflicts is therefore a matter of perspective. From an operational standpoint, they represent engagements in which Imperial assets sustain damage and attempt to respond. From an analytical standpoint, they are interactions between a known system and an unknown variable, producing outcomes that resemble combat without fulfilling its defining criteria. These records, while fragmented and limited, provide the most direct evidence of how the Umbra function under conditions of resistance. They confirm that the entities are not passive anomalies but active participants in their immediate environment. However, they also reinforce the conclusion that the Umbra do not operate within the frameworks that define warfare. Their involvement in these events is incidental, shaped by the same underlying traits that govern their existence in all other contexts. Records compiled following Umbra-related engagements do not conclude with conventional victory or defeat designations. Instead, they transition into loss accounting, infrastructure reassessment, and the recalibration of operational protocols. The aftermath of these encounters is defined not by territorial change or strategic gain, but by measurable degradation in assets, personnel, and logistical continuity. Across multiple sectors, post-incident documentation reflects a consistent pattern in both immediate consequences and long-term adjustments. Administratum archives categorize Umbra encounters under exceptional loss events, distinct from piracy, xenos incursion, or navigational error. This classification is based on the absence of recoverable adversary assets, the lack of engagement continuity, and the unique damage signatures observed. Vessels affected by Umbra contact are often deemed irrecoverable, even when structural integrity appears partially intact. The removal of critical material sections introduces vulnerabilities that cannot be reliably repaired under standard conditions, leading to decommissioning or controlled salvage operations. Salvage efforts themselves present additional complications. Recovery crews operating within Umbra-affected zones must maintain continuous high-output illumination, increasing both energy consumption and equipment strain. Even under such conditions, the risk of residual Umbra presence cannot be fully eliminated. Several reports document secondary losses during salvage operations, where newly arrived vessels encountered the same anomalies that compromised the original target. As a result, Administratum guidelines now recommend limited recovery attempts, prioritizing Delta retrieval over material salvage. Personnel losses associated with these incidents are recorded with similar caution. In many cases, the absence effect leaves no recoverable remains, complicating both identification and classification. Casualty reports frequently include notations indicating partial or total absence of biological material, a designation rarely used outside of extreme warp-related incidents. This ambiguity affects not only record accuracy, but also the allocation of compensatory resources as standard verification procedures cannot be completed. The broader logistical impact becomes evident over extended periods. Trade routes affected by repeated Umbra activity show declining reliability indices, prompting gradual reclassification within Administratum navigation charts. Systems dependent on these routes experience delays in resource delivery, leading to secondary effects on production, maintenance, and population stability. These disruptions are rarely immediate but accumulate over time, creating systemic inefficiencies that are difficult to isolate to a single cause. To mitigate these effects, the Administratum has implemented layered routing strategies. Primary corridors are supplemented with secondary and tertiary paths, each assigned variable risk ratings based on historical Umbra activity. This redundancy increases overall network resilience, but introduces additional complexity in route management and scheduling. The need to maintain multiple viable pathways places strain on administrative resources and requires continuous data analysis to remain effective. From the perspective of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the aftermath of Umbra encounters represents an opportunity for data acquisition, albeit one constrained by risk and incomplete access. Damaged vessels and installations provide the only available material evidence of Umbra interaction. These sites are subjected to detailed examination, focusing on the boundaries of removed material and the residual effects on surrounding structures. Mechanicus analysis confirms that the absence effect maintains consistent properties across different encounters. The edges of affected Kshetron remain smooth at both macro and micro scales, with no detectable residue or deformation. This uniformity suggests a process that operates independently of material composition or structural complexity. Whether interacting with reinforced hull plating or organic tissue, the result is identical, reinforcing the hypothesis that the Umbra's effect is not a function of energy transfer but of spatial alteration. Instrumentation deployed during post-incident analysis often records transient anomalies, even in the absence of visible Umbra. These readings include minor fluctuations in local energy fields and irregularities in sensor calibration. While not sufficient to confirm continued presence, they indicate that the environment retains measurable disturbances following an encounter. The duration of these disturbances varies, with some dissipating within standard timeframes and others persisting beyond expected limits. Mechanicus research divisions have attempted to replicate these conditions in controlled environments, using high-energy systems and variable light configurations. These experiments have not produced Umbra manifestations, suggesting that their presence cannot be artificially induced through known methods. This limitation reinforces the conclusion that the Umbra originate from conditions or processes not currently understood or reproducible. Despite this, the Mechanicus continues to explore potential applications derived from Umbra-related phenomena. The ability to remove matter without residue presents theoretical advantages in both industrial processing and weapon development. Conceptual models have been proposed for systems capable of replicating the absence effect on a controlled scale. However, without an understanding of the underlying mechanism, these models remain speculative and lack practical implementation. The combined analysis of Administratum and Mechanicus data leads to a convergent assessment of the Umbra's impact. They are not adversaries in the strategic sense, but they function as disruptive agents within operational environments. Their presence introduces uncertainty that cannot be fully mitigated through existing technology or doctrine. This uncertainty affects decision-making at multiple levels, from individual vessel operations to sector-wide logistical planning. In evaluating the cumulative effects of Umbra encounters, several consistent outcomes emerge. First, there is a measurable increase in operational cost. maintaining heightened illumination, reinforcing system redundancies, and adjusting routing protocols all require additional resources. Second, there is a reduction in efficiency. Detours, delays, and equipment degradation contribute to decreased throughput across affected networks. Third, there is an increase in risk exposure. Even with mitigative measures in place, the unpredictability of Umbra behavior prevents the establishment of fully secure operating conditions. These outcomes necessitate a shift in how such phenomena are integrated into Imperial frameworks. Rather than attempting to eliminate or control the Umbra, current doctrine emphasizes adaptation. Systems are designed to function within environments where Umbra presence is possible, incorporating flexibility and redundancy as core principles. This approach does not resolve the underlying challenge, but allows for continued operation despite it. The final analysis, as recorded in cross-departmental summaries, reflects a cautious consensus. The Umbra are to be treated as persistent environmental variables with active properties. They are neither rare anomalies nor predictable threats, but recurring conditions that intersect with Imperial activity at irregular intervals. Their effects are consistent enough to be recognized, yet insufficiently understood to be anticipated with precision. From the Administratum's perspective, success is measured in the maintenance of functional networks despite these disruptions. From the Mechanicus standpoint, progress is defined by incremental increases in understanding, even when direct study remains unattainable. Both perspectives acknowledge the same limitation. The Umbra operate according to principles that remain outside current comprehension. In practical terms, this results in a doctrine of controlled exposure. Engagement is minimized, observation is prioritized, and withdrawal remains the primary response when conditions exceed acceptable thresholds. These guidelines reflect not a lack of capability, but an acknowledgement of the boundaries within which current knowledge operates. The Umbra, as recorded through these conflicts and their aftermath, do not conform to the expectations of enemy, resource, or phenomenon. They exist at the intersection of these categories without fully belonging to any of them. Their impact is measurable, their behavior is partially predictable, and their nature remains unresolved. As such, they continue to occupy a position within Imperial records defined not by classification, but by the effects they impose and the limitations they reveal. Inquisitorial records concerning the Umbra diverge immediately from Administratum and Mechanicus documentation in both tone and classification priority. Where other branches emphasize logistical disruption or material analysis, the Inquisition frames the Umbra as a phenomenon requiring continuous observation due to its deviation from established natural and immaterial laws. Initial impressions, drawn from cross-sector incident reviews, identify the Umbra not as a localized anomaly, but as a recurring presence that resists integration into any known category of threat or entity. Early Inquisition interest was triggered not by the frequency of encounters, but by the consistency of contradictions within those encounters. Reports submitted from unrelated sectors, separated by significant distance and time, described identical effects with minimal variation. Light removal without residual energy displacement, matter absence without detectable transition, and behavioral patterns lacking escalation or intent were all noted as recurring constants. This level of consistency, combined with the absence of a traceable origin, prompted formal inclusion within restricted observation archives. Direct Inquisition observations are limited, as most encounters rely on second-hand data or recovered records. However, in cases where Ordo agents have been present during Umbra manifestations, their accounts introduce elements not recorded in standard reports. One such observation involves the perception of scale. While mechanical instruments register a finite boundary to the Umbra's presence, human observers report difficulty in maintaining a fixed sense of size or distance. The entity appears to shift relative position without measurable movement, as if its spatial definition is not anchored to consistent coordinates. This discrepancy between instrument and perception is not isolated. Multiple inquisitorial logs note that prolonged observation of an Umbra results in subtle cognitive strain. Agents report difficulty maintaining focus, with visual tracking becoming unreliable over time. In extreme cases, observers have described the sensation that the Umbra is not merely present in space, but occupying the act of observation itself, interfering with the process by which it is perceived. These accounts remain unverified through instrumentation, yet their recurrence has led to their inclusion as a potential secondary effect of Umbra proximity. Another area of concern arises from the Umbra's interaction with shadow itself. While Administratum and Mechanicus records describe the Umbra as existing within darkness, Inquisition analysis suggests a more complex relationship. In several controlled observations, Umbra have been seen extending beyond existing shadows, creating new regions of darkness that do not correspond to any physical obstruction of light. These regions persist briefly even after the Umbra withdraws, indicating that the entity does not simply occupy shadow, but may generate it as a byproduct of its presence. This phenomenon challenges the conventional understanding of light and absence. Under normal conditions, shadow is defined by the obstruction of a light source. In the case of the Umbra, shadow appears without such obstruction, existing independently of any identifiable cause. This has led to speculation that the Umbra are not interacting with light directly, but with the conditions that allow light to exist within real space. If accurate, this would position them not as absorbers of light, but as disruptors of the framework that governs its propagation. Inquisitorial observations also document irregularities in temporal perception during Umbra encounters. Timekeeping devices remain consistent, but subjective experience among observers varies. Some report brief encounters that, upon review of recorded data, lasted significantly longer. Others experience extended periods of observation that correspond to minimal recorded duration. This divergence suggests that the Umbra may influence perception at a level not captured by standard measurement, though no direct manipulation of time itself has been confirmed. Of particular note are instances where Umbra activity coincides with minimal or absent warp disturbance. Standard Inquisition protocol assumes that phenomena deviating from physical law will exhibit some correlation with the immaterium. In the case of the Umbra, this correlation is inconsistent. In several documented encounters, psychic operatives reported no significant warp presence, even at close proximity. In others, faint disturbances were detected, but these lacked the volatility or resonance typically associated with warp entities. This inconsistency has led to a divided interpretation within inquisitorial analysis. One perspective holds that the Umbra operate entirely outside the warp, representing a phenomenon native to real space, but governed by principles not yet understood. Another suggests that they may exist in a state that partially intersects with the immaterium without fully manifesting within it. A third, less widely supported theory proposes that the Umbra originate from a domain separate from both real space and warp, intersecting with each only under specific conditions. Unexplainable findings extend to the Umbra's apparent resistance to psychic interaction. Attempts to detect, influence, or disrupt the entities through sanctioned psychic means have produced negligible results. Unlike warp entities, which often react strongly to psychic presence, the Umbra remain unaffected or unresponsive. This absence of reaction further complicates classification, as it removes one of the primary tools used by the Inquisition to identify and categorize non-physical threats. In rare instances, however, psychic operatives have reported indirect effects. These do not take the form of communication or resistance, but rather a reduction in sensory clarity. Psychic perception, when directed toward an Umbra, often returns incomplete or distorted impressions, as though the entity does not register within the expected spectrum. This has been described not as a presence that cannot be read, but as an absence within the field of perception itself. Additional observations concern the aftermath of Umbra encounters in enclosed environments. In certain cases, areas previously affected by the entity exhibit lingering anomalies. Shadows within these areas behave inconsistently, appearing sharper or more defined than surrounding light conditions would suggest. Illumination within these spaces may fluctuate without corresponding changes in power supply. While these effects diminish over time, their persistence indicates that the Umbra's influence may extend beyond the duration of direct contact. The Inquisition has also documented instances where Umbra manifestations occur in proximity to each other within confined regions. Unlike earlier observations that suggested independent operation, these cases introduce the possibility of interaction. However, no coordinated behaviour has been confirmed. The entities do not merge, repel, or align in any observable pattern. Their coexistence appears to be a function of environmental conditions rather than mutual awareness. One of the more unusual findings involves the absence of secondary ecological impact. In environments where Umbra activity has been recorded, there is no evidence of long-term alteration to local systems beyond immediate material loss. Flora, fauna, and atmospheric conditions remain stable once the entity departs. This lack of lasting influence contrasts with most phenomena that disrupt physical law, which often produce cascading effects. The Umbra's impact is precise and contained, ending at the boundary of their presence. Inquisitorial impressions drawn from these observations remain cautious and unresolved. The Umbra are not classified as demonic, as they lack the defining traits of warp entities. They are not identified as xenos, as they do not exhibit biological structure or behaviour. They are not considered technological constructs, as there is no evidence of design or function beyond intrinsic properties. This leaves them without a clear designation within existing threat categories. As a result, the Umbra are maintained within restricted archives under provisional classification, subject to ongoing observation and review. Their presence is monitored, but not actively pursued except under controlled conditions. Engagement is discouraged unless necessary for data collection or immediate threat mitigation. This approach reflects the recognition that current understanding is insufficient to support more direct intervention. The Umbra remain an unresolved phenomenon, defined as much by what cannot be measured as by what can. Their consistent behaviour contrasts with the instability of their effects on perception and environment, creating a duality that resists simple explanation. For the Inquisition, this combination of consistency and contradiction represents a condition that must be observed with caution, recorded with precision, and approached without assumption. Inquisitorial records concerning the Umbra diverge immediately from Administratum and Mechanicus documentation in both tone and classification priority. Where other branches emphasize logistical disruption or material analysis, the Inquisition frames the Umbra as a phenomenon requiring continuous observation due to its deviation from established natural and immaterial laws. Initial impressions drawn from cross-sector incident reviews identify the Umbra not as a localized anomaly, but as a recurring presence that resists integration into any known category of threat or entity. Early Inquisition interest was not driven by frequency of encounters, but by the consistency of contradictions within those encounters. Reports submitted from distant sectors, separated by time and geography, describe identical effects with minimal variation. Light removal occurs without measurable energy displacement. Matter absence leaves no residue, no trace, and no transitional state. Behavioral patterns show no escalation, no hostility curve, and no deviation across encounters. This level of consistency, combined with the absence of a traceable origin, resulted in the Umbra being entered into restricted archives for continuous monitoring. Direct Inquisition observations remain limited. Most encounters rely on recovered logs, fragmented pict feeds, and testimony from surviving personnel. However, in cases where Ordo agents were present during manifestation events, additional variables were recorded that do not appear in standard reports. One recurring observation involves instability in perceived scale. Instrumentation consistently records finite spatial boundaries, yet human observers report difficulty maintaining a fixed sense of size or distance. The Umbra appears closer or larger without measurable movement, as if its spatial definition does not fully align with real space positioning. This discrepancy extends beyond scale into the act of observation itself. In multiple logs, prolonged visual tracking results in gradual cognitive strain. Observers report loss of focus, difficulty maintaining visual continuity, and an inability to consistently define the entity's outline. In more severe cases, agents describe the sensation that the Umbra interferes with perception directly, not by altering the environment, but by disrupting the process through which it is observed. These accounts remain unverified through mechanical systems, yet their recurrence has resulted in formal inclusion as a secondary effect of proximity. Further inquisitorial analysis challenges the assumption that the Umbra merely inhabit darkness. In controlled observation environments, Umbra manifestations have been recorded extending beyond pre-existing shadow boundaries. Regions of darkness form when no physical obstruction to light is present. These areas persist briefly after the Umbra withdraws, indicating that the entity does not simply occupy shadow, but generates it as a direct consequence of its presence. This finding introduces a significant contradiction. Under known physical principles, shadow requires obstruction. In the case of the Umbra, darkness appears without cause, suggesting interference not with light itself, but with the conditions that allow light to propagate. If accurate, this positions the Umbra not as absorbers, but as localized disruptions of real space conditions governing illumination. Temporal perception during Umbra encounters presents another irregularity. Chronometric devices remain stable and accurate, yet subjective experience among observers varies. Some report encounters lasting seconds that correspond to extended recorded durations. Others experience prolonged exposure while logs indicate minimal elapsed time. No measurable distortion of time itself has been detected, suggesting that the effect is limited to perception rather than physical chronology. Correlation with the immaterium remains inconsistent. Standard Inquisition protocol assumes that phenomena deviating from physical law will produce detectable warp signatures. In Umbra encounters, this correlation is unreliable. In several documented cases, psychic operatives reported no warp presence even at close range. In others, faint disturbances were detected, but these lack the instability, resonance, or symbolic manifestation associated with warp entities. This inconsistency has led to multiple interpretations within inquisitorial analysis. One position holds that the Umbra exist entirely within real space, governed by principles not yet understood. Another suggests partial intersection with the immaterium without full manifestation. A third proposes that the Umbra originate from a domain separate from both real space and warp, intersecting with each only under specific and unknown conditions. None of these interpretations have been confirmed. Psychic interaction has produced minimal results. Attempts to detect or influence Umbra through sanctioned psychic methods have consistently failed to produce measurable response. Unlike warp entities, which often react to psychic presence, the Umbra remain unaffected. They do not resist, respond, or acknowledge such attempts. This absence of interaction removes one of the primary classification tools available to the Inquisition. In rare instances, indirect effects have been reported. Psychic operatives describe incomplete or absent readings when focusing on an Umbra. Rather than detecting resistance or interference, they report a void in perception, as if the entity does not register within the psychic spectrum. This has been described not as invisibility, but as absence within the field of detection itself. Post-encounter environments present additional anomalies. Enclosed sectors previously exposed to Umbra activity exhibit temporary inconsistencies in shadow behavior. Shadows appear sharper than expected, or persist in configurations that do not match current light sources. Illumination may fluctuate without corresponding changes in power systems. These effects diminish over time, but indicate that the Umbra's influence can extend briefly beyond direct presence. Instances involving multiple Umbra within confined regions introduce further uncertainty. While earlier observations suggested independent operation, these cases raise the possibility of interaction. However, no coordinated behavior has been confirmed. The entities do not align, merge, or exhibit synchronized movement. Their coexistence appears to result from shared environmental conditions rather than mutual awareness. One notable absence in all inquisitorial findings is long-term ecological impact. Environments affected by Umbra activity do not exhibit sustained alteration beyond immediate material loss. Atmospheric conditions, biological systems, and structural stability return to baseline once the entity departs. This precision contrasts with most anomalous phenomena, which produce cascading or residual effects. The Umbra's influence is contained, defined strictly by the limit of their presence. Inquisitorial impressions remain unresolved. The Umbra do not conform to any established classification. They lack the defining traits of demonic entities, showing no dependence on emotion or warp resonance. They do not align with known xenos species, lacking biological structure or evolutionary markers. They do not exhibit characteristics of technological constructs, as there is no evidence of design, mechanism, or function beyond intrinsic properties. As a result, the Umbra are maintained under restricted classification, subject to continued observation and analysis. Engagement protocols emphasize caution, with direct interaction limited to controlled circumstances. Data collection remains the primary objective, while avoidance is recommended when risk exceeds acceptable thresholds. In summary, inquisitorial observations expand the Umbra profile beyond physical interaction. Perceptual instability, shadow generation, and inconsistent warp correlation introduce variables that challenge existing frameworks. These findings do not provide definitive explanations, but they establish the Umbra as a phenomenon operating at the limits of current understanding. They remain defined by absence, not only in matter and light, but in classification itself. Inquisitorial archives concerning the Umbra expand significantly in volume when restricted files and sealed reports are considered. These records differ from standard observations in that they contain irregularities not suitable for general circulation, either due to lack of verification, contradiction with established doctrine, or the presence of phenomena that cannot be reconciled with known physical or immaterial laws. Within these documents, the Umbra are no longer treated solely as an external hazard, but as a recurring anomaly that produces secondary effects beyond their immediate interaction with matter and light. One recurring anomaly appears in reports where Umbra manifestations occur without prior environmental indicators. In earlier records, Umbra presence correlates with low-light conditions or areas of reduced illumination. However, sealed reports describe instances where entities manifest within fully illuminated environments, including high-output voidship interiors and fortified installations operating at maximum lumen capacity. In these cases, the Umbra do not displace light gradually, but appear fully formed within it, maintaining their characteristic absence effect despite conditions previously considered unfavourable. These manifestations are brief but consistent in structure. The entity emerges without transitional phase, interacts with surrounding material, and dissipates within a contained duration. Attempts to correlate these events with power fluctuations or environmental changes have failed to produce consistent results. This contradicts earlier assumptions that sustained darkness is a prerequisite for Umbra stability, suggesting that under certain conditions this limitation may be bypassed or irrelevant. Another category of sealed reports focuses on delayed manifestation. In these cases, Umbra activity is recorded in locations that have been previously exposed to the entity, but only after a measurable period has elapsed. These events occur without any direct evidence of the Umbra's arrival. There is no recorded approach, no sensor detection, and no transitional anomaly. The entity is simply present, already interacting with the environment at the moment of detection. This pattern has led to speculation that the Umbra do not traverse space in a conventional manner. Instead of moving between locations, they may emerge at points where conditions align, independent of distance or continuity. This interpretation remains unconfirmed, but it is supported by the absence of recorded transit in several well-documented cases. Documented encounters within sealed archives also include instances of partial manifestation. Unlike standard observations, where the Umbra present as cohesive entities, these cases describe fragmented or incomplete forms. Portions of the entity appear without a central mass, existing as isolated areas of absence that move independently for short durations before dissipating. These fragments retain the same interaction properties, removing matter upon contact, but lack the stability and persistence of full manifestations. In one such report, a research station recorded multiple fragmentary Umbra appearing simultaneously across different sections of the structure. Each fragment interacted with local systems, causing localized material loss and system failure. The event lasted less than 1 standard minute, after which all fragments dissipated without trace. No central entity was observed, and no correlation between the fragments was established. This event remains classified due to its deviation from all previously recorded behavior. Sealed reports also document anomalies involving reflective and refractive surfaces. Under normal conditions, the Umbra's absence effect prevents any interaction with light that would produce reflection. However, in controlled environments containing mirrored surfaces or crystalline structures, observers have reported secondary distortions that do not align with direct line of sight. These distortions appear as delayed or displaced areas of absence, suggesting that the Umbra's interaction with light may extend beyond immediate contact. This phenomenon has not been consistently reproduced, and its mechanism remains unknown. It introduces the possibility that the Umbra's influence is not limited to their visible boundary, but may propagate through indirect pathways under specific conditions. Due to the lack of repeatable data, this remains a subject of restricted study. One of the more controversial sealed findings involves recorded interaction between an Umbra and a sanctioned Psyker. During a controlled observation, the Psyker reported an absence within the psychic field, consistent with previous accounts. However, at a specific point during the encounter, the Psyker described a momentary inversion of perception, in which the absence appeared to take form. This was not recorded by instrumentation, and could not be verified by other observers. Following this event, the Psyker experienced complete sensory disorientation and required immediate containment. Subsequent evaluations found no lasting physical damage, but cognitive assessments indicated a persistent inability to accurately describe the event. The report remains sealed due to the inability to determine whether the experience represents a genuine interaction or a perceptual anomaly induced by proximity. Additional anomalies concern the persistence of Umbra-related effects in data systems. In several instances, recorded picked feeds and sensor logs exhibit inconsistencies that persist after the encounter has concluded. Frames may contain regions of absence that do not correspond to any recorded Umbra position, or data streams may show interruptions that cannot be attributed to system failure. These irregularities remain embedded within the data, resisting correction or removal through standard procedures. Mechanicus analysis of these anomalies has not produced a definitive explanation. The data does not behave as corrupted information, nor does it conform to known forms of interference. It exists as a consistent but unexplainable deviation within otherwise stable records. As a result, such data is often isolated and restricted to prevent contamination of broader archives. Sealed reports also include instances of repeated manifestation within identical locations over extended periods. These locations, often abandoned installations or low-traffic void sectors, exhibit Umbra activity at irregular intervals without apparent cause. The event does not follow a predictable schedule, but their recurrence suggests that certain environments may retain conditions favourable to manifestation. Attempts to identify these conditions have not yielded conclusive results. In one documented case, an abandoned orbital platform recorded Umbra presence across multiple years, with each event occurring in a different section of the structure. The platform was eventually designated as a restricted zone, and no further attempts at study were authorized. The reason for this classification was not the frequency of manifestations, but the increasing irregularity in their behavior, which deviated further from established patterns over time. The cumulative effect of these anomalies is a growing divergence between standard and restricted understanding of the Umbra. While general records describe a consistent set of traits and behaviors, sealed reports introduce variables that cannot be reconciled with those observations. This creates a layered classification in which the Umbra are both predictable and unpredictable, stable and variable, depending on the scope of data considered. From the Inquisition's perspective, these contradictions are not treated as errors, but as indicators of incomplete understanding. The Umbra are not assumed to change behaviour arbitrarily. Instead, it is considered more likely that observed variations represent different expressions of the same underlying phenomenon influenced by factors not yet identified. As a result, sealed reports are maintained as a critical component of Umbra analysis. They are not used to redefine existing knowledge, but to expand the range of possible interpretations. Each anomaly is recorded without assumption, preserved for future correlation with data that may provide context or explanation. In summary, the anomalies and documented encounters contained within sealed Inquisition archives extend the Umbra profile beyond the limits of standard observation. Manifestations without darkness, delayed appearances, fragmentary forms, and data irregularities all contribute to a broader understanding that remains incomplete. These findings do not replace established knowledge, but they challenge its boundaries, indicating that the Umbra operate within a framework that has yet to be fully defined. They remain consistent in their effects, yet inconsistent in their conditions of appearance. This duality continues to define their classification, reinforcing their status as an unresolved phenomenon within inquisitorial records. The most restricted inquisitorial materials concerning the Umbra are contained within classified files that are not circulated beyond select Ordo-level clearance. These records do not function as conventional reports, but as compilations of unresolved observations, cross-referenced anomalies, and internal assessments that have failed to reach formal conclusion. Within these files, the Umbra are no longer approached as an isolated phenomenon, but as a persistent inconsistency within the broader framework of Imperial understanding. Classified entries indicate that repeated analysis has not produced convergence toward a single explanatory model. Instead, each additional dataset introduces further deviation. Patterns observed in earlier records remain valid, yet they do not scale across all documented encounters. The Umbra maintain consistency and immediate effect, specifically the removal of matter and absence of light, but the conditions under which these effects occur continue to expand beyond initial parameters. One such classification thread concerns spatial integrity. While standard observations treat the Umbra as occupying definable areas within real space, certain classified reports challenge this assumption. In these cases, the boundary of the Umbra does not behave as a stable limit. Objects partially intersecting the entity do not always experience uniform removal. Instead, there are recorded instances where contact results in incomplete interaction, leaving portions of material unaffected despite direct overlap. This suggests that the Umbra's area of influence may not be continuous, but structured in a manner that does not conform to conventional geometry. This irregularity extends into the concept of interior space. No confirmed observation has successfully determined whether the Umbra possess internal structure. Attempts to probe or measure depth have failed due to the immediate loss of any instrument entering the area. However, theoretical models within classified files propose that the absence observed may not represent a surface, but a boundary to a region that cannot be accessed through physical means. These proposals remain speculative, yet they persist due to the absence of contradictory evidence. Further classified analysis addresses the issue of persistence across records. In several instances, Umbra encounters separated by significant temporal and spatial distance exhibit identical structural characteristics beyond statistical probability. Not only are their form and behavior consistent, but specific events appear to replicate with minimal variation. This has led to internal debate regarding whether these encounters represent multiple entities or repeated manifestations of a single continuous phenomenon. No conclusion has been reached. The data supports both interpretations equally. If the Umbra are singular, their presence would imply a form of existence not bound by location. If they are multiple, their uniformity would suggest a level of consistency that exceeds known biological or mechanical replication processes. Both possibilities remain incompatible with established classifications. A separate group of classified files addresses the interaction between Umbra presence and cognitive processing. While earlier observations record perceptual instability, deeper analysis suggests that this effect may extend beyond sensory disruption. In controlled conditions, observers exposed to repeated Umbra encounters demonstrate increasing difficulty in recalling specific details of those encounters, even when supported by recorded evidence. Memory degradation does not follow standard patterns associated with trauma or psychic interference. Instead, it appears selective, affecting only information directly related to the Umbra. This phenomenon has led to restricted protocols limiting repeated exposure among personnel. The concern is not immediate incapacitation, but gradual erosion of accurate recall, which compromises the integrity of long-term study. Inquisitorial assessment does not classify this as an active defensive mechanism, as no direct causation has been established. However, its consistency across multiple cases has resulted in formal acknowledgement within classified guidelines. Additional files explore the absence of escalation. Across all recorded encounters, the Umbra do not demonstrate adaptive or reactive behavior. They do not respond to threat, do not alter interaction based on external stimulus, and do not exhibit learning patterns. This absence of response is itself treated as an anomaly. Most phenomena, whether biological, mechanical, or warp-based, display some degree of interaction with their environment. The Umbra do not. This has produced a paradox within inquisitorial classification. The Umbra are capable of causing material loss and operational disruption, yet they cannot be said to act with intent. Their behavior does not align with hostility, yet the consequences of their presence are functionally indistinguishable from targeted destruction. As a result, intent is excluded from their classification entirely, replaced by a focus on effect alone. One of the most heavily restricted topics within classified files concerns the potential for undetected presence. While most encounters are identified through visible or recorded interaction, certain analyses suggest that Umbra may exist outside the limits of current detection methods. This hypothesis arises from discrepancies in material inventories and structural integrity reports that cannot be attributed to known causes. In these cases, matter is absent without any recorded Umbra manifestation. No visual, sensor, or environmental data indicates their presence, yet the result is consistent with known Umbra interaction. These incidents remain unverified as direct Umbra activity, but their inclusion in classified files reflects the possibility that current observation methods are insufficient. Attempts to develop detection systems beyond visual confirmation have not produced reliable results. Thermal, electromagnetic, and gravimetric sensors all fail to register consistent signatures. Even in controlled environments, the Umbra remain detectable only through their direct effects. This limitation reinforces the Inquisition's reliance on indirect observation and post-event analysis. Final inquisitorial assessments do not provide resolution, but they do establish a stable framework for continued classification. The Umbra are defined not by origin, structure, or intent, but by consistent interaction. The removal of matter, the absence of light, and the disruption of perception. Beyond these constants, all other variables remain open. From the Inquisition's perspective, the primary concern is not the immediate threat posed by the Umbra, but the implications of their existence. They represent a phenomenon that operates without alignment to known systems, resisting integration into both scientific and metaphysical frameworks. This places them outside the boundaries of current Imperial understanding, requiring ongoing observation without expectation of near-term resolution. In conclusion, classified files reinforce the position that the Umbra cannot be reduced to a singular explanation. Each layer of analysis adds clarity to their effects while expanding uncertainty in their nature. They remain consistent in outcome, yet undefined in cause, existing as a persistent anomaly within the records of the Inquisition. Their classification is maintained not as a reflection of the knowledge achieved, but as an acknowledgement of a knowledge that remains incomplete.